Hello, my name is Ari Friedlander. I'm an associate researcher at the UC Santa Cruz Institute for Marine Science and the director of research for the California Ocean Alliance. And I'm excited to share with you a talk this evening called Lights, Camera, Action, Uncovering the Secret Lives of Whales. First off, I'd like to thank those who helped make this research possible. Most of the funding for this work has been provided by the National Science Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, and the International Whaling Commission, as well as thanks to those who helped to make this work a success, including my collaborators from the Hopkins Marine Station at Stanford University, Duke University, the Australian Antarctic Division, and NOAA, and especially to those who waited behind while we went far afield to collect these data. First off, a little bit of personal information. I'm a Connecticut Yankee. I'm a California transplant, I guess. I grew up on the coast of Connecticut, and in the 17th and 18th century, the Yankee whaling industry was a huge part of what made that part of the world successful economically. And because of that, whales have been ingrained into the cultural history of that area, not necessarily as something to revere, but more as a commodity and something that really helped to literally light the lamps in places like Boston and Providence and Connecticut. Unbeknownst to me while I was growing up, I was about 12 miles away from the birthplace of Nathaniel Palmer, who's the gentleman on the bottom left, who was one of the first people to set foot on the Antarctic continent in 1821. And I certainly had no illusions of being an Antarctic researcher when I was young. Most of my training after college was in functional morphology and anatomy. I was in a research lab that studied this in marine mammals at UNC Wilmington, and then moved on to ecology at Duke University. And it was here that I was sort of provided with the opportunities to head south and begin research in the Antarctic. One of the pieces of work that I find most entertaining about the golden age of Antarctic exploration about 100 years ago is a book by Apsley Cherry Gerard called The Worst Journey in the World, in which he says that polar exploration is at once the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time which has been devised. And I'll return to this at the end of this talk and hopefully try to convince you that things hopefully have changed in the last 100 years in ways in which we are able to appreciate and enjoy working in the Antarctic. Now, I mentioned my sort of academic training, and I think this has really helped to create my philosophy about how I do my science. Having a background in anatomy and physiology and literally thinking about how animals are put together has given me a perspective to try and understand a group of animals like marine mammals that have evolved and adapted for life in a very different environment than terrestrial animals. And because of these adaptations and the things that these animals have evolved, it really shapes their behavior. And in order to be successful, in the marine ecosystem, you need to have a suite of behaviors that takes advantage of the adaptations that you have for diving and breath holding and all of these other things that are required to maintain your body condition. And these help me, I think, appreciate the ecology of these animals and how the behavior of what we study is linked to their environment and how changes in the environment impact these animals. In order to do this kind of work, I rely on a bunch of different types of technologies, from echo sounders that are very expensive fish finders to biologging instruments. And this is where I'm going to focus on my research today, is how we use tags to study these animals. I think one of the great things about what we do is that not only do we get to produce science, but we have the opportunity to use this information to help conservation efforts in terms of marine protected area development, and then education in terms of being able to promote understanding of these animals and the ecology of these animals at undergraduate level, at the graduate level, in primary and secondary school, but also in the greater population and audiences like this that are interested in what we do and interested in the natural world. I think we have a priority to try and be able to present the information that we gain to audiences like this. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this. And hopefully we'll all sort of at the end realize that hopefully whales are a good analog for these kinds of studies and help us understand the oceans a little bit better. So minke whales are an animal that I want to focus on tonight. And who are these animals? Well, they're the smallest of the baleen whales. They're about a third of the size of the blue whales that we see here in Monterey Bay. They're the most numerous baleen whale in the Southern Ocean. There's hundreds of thousands of them, and they live primarily in the sea ice. They make some very strange noises. One's called a bioduck. They make some other sounds that sound like Star Wars action going on. And very little is known about their behavior, mostly because they live in such an extreme environment that's very challenging to get to and difficult to work in. However, there have been thousands of these animals killed for scientific research in the past, which was thought to be necessary in order to study their feeding habits and their reproductive rates. And because they live in an environment like sea ice around the Antarctic, they may be severely affected by climate change if conditions were to go sort of south for them. And I'll touch on this at the end of the talk. Now, one of the things I find also really interesting about baleen whales is that they're one of a number of animals that over the last 100 million years have shared this dynasty of giant filter feeding fishes, or in this case, mammals, in the ocean. From things like manta rays to basking sharks to whale sharks to megamouth to baleen whales, there's been this independent evolution of not only large body size, but a feeding adaptation that takes advantage of being able to filter out a lot of very small things. Now, in the ocean, primary production drives the food web here. And because of that, there are so many and tons and tons and tons and tons of small bodied phytoplankton and zooplankton that make up the base of the food web. And this biomass makes it absolutely fantastic for animals that can take advantage of it. And so in the ocean, if you're able to eat a lot of things in a very effective and efficient way, it allows you to be able to support a large body size. And baleen whales are one of those examples. Now, another way to think about how these animals are able to get so much food is to look at a study that a colleague of ours, Jeremy Goldbogen, did, where he evaluated data from the whaling industry at South Georgia and in the Antarctic in the 1920s. And what he measured was the engulfment capacity of baleen whales. In this image, you can see that the length of the whale is one thing, but they have this very distendable throat pouch that opens up almost like a parachute when the whale accelerates and opens its mouth underwater to capture a bunch of prey-laden water. And what Jeremy measured was that if you were an 18-meter long whale, when you open your mouth and take in a gulp of water, you can amass an engulfment capacity that is equivalent to 100% of your body weight. So effectively, if you're a 50-ton whale, you can get 50 tons of water in your mouth every time you feed. This scales with body size. So a blue whale that is 24 meters long can engulf 133% of its body weight, whereas a minke whale, much more diminutive, can still get 75% of its body weight in water in one mouthful. So if you're able to effectively find dense prey patches, you can really make quite a living, and you can feed in an extremely efficient way because of this massive engulfment capacity. But it does have its downsides. It's an incredibly energetically costly thing for an animal to do, especially if you're a breath holding animal. And the bigger your mouth cavity, the longer it takes for you to filter out that water. And so what this graph shows here is the relationship between the number of times a baleen whale can feed versus the amount it can actually process in terms of water. And from left to right, we go from smaller whales, the minke whales, to blue whales on the right, which are the largest. So there's a trade-off here. Minke whales, and I'll show you some evidence of this, can feed up to 20 or 24 times on a given dive, whereas a blue whale can only lunge feed maybe 5 or 6 times. However, because that engulfment capacity is so massive, a blue whale can actually filter out about 16 times more water per unit time than a minke whale can, even though it's feeding at about 4 times slower the rate. So what are the tools that we use to make these kinds of calculations and understand these animals? Well, on the right are sort of a number of different, the suite of different things that we use as researchers, depending on the question we're asking. From things like satellites that collect remotely sensed data to drones that capture images like the one you see here of the body condition and size of whales, to acoustics, to biopsy samples, and then to tags. And I'm going to be talking mostly about these biologging tools that help us study the underwater movement and behavior of these animals. Now, this is the environment that we're working in, and it's an absolutely spectacular place to work. This is a place called Anvord Bay on the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula. And what you see is a very different type of ocean surface from what we're used to here. We have icebergs, you have bergy bits, you have growlers, you have pieces of pack ice, you have a lot of brash ice, and it covers the surface of the ocean in very different ways. You can have very calm days like this, and then it's, if the winds start to blow or the currents increase in a certain area, this dynamic environment changes quite rapidly. You may have zero ice cover in one area, and you may have 100% ice cover in another. And because of that, it really requires animals that have adapted and evolved life history strategies to be able to take advantage of these changes in their environment. And animals that are intolerant of sea ice are largely going to be absent from these areas unless things change. So one of the things that our research has been interested in doing is using this suite of emerging technologies like tag data to increase our knowledge of poorly known species like the Antarctic minke whale and characterize their foraging behavior, understand how they utilize sea ice, and use this information to better define their ecological roles. This is one of my favorite images that we collected in a recent field effort. This is collected by Casey Bierlich, who's a PhD student of ours at Duke University. And it shows a group of 5 minke whales. And to me, this is an outstanding image because, for the first off, we didn't really understand that these animals fed in groups or socialized in groups before we put a drone up in the air and could see the number of animals that were in a group. The other thing that's cool is that you can see very individualized, distinct characteristics of the pigmentation patterns. The animals have very different chevron markings across their back. The flanks near the dorsal fin have different colors. The wisps behind the blowholes that look kind of like smoke trailing out are unique to each individual. And then especially cool for me in this picture is that 4 of the 5 animals here have tags on them. And this is a tremendous opportunity for us to learn about not only individual behavior, but also to think about how these animals coordinate themselves and maybe potentially feed in groups. There's some other things we can learn about these whales simply from observing them and from photography. And these are 2 different minke whales that were surfaced about a minute apart in a feeding group in the Antarctic Peninsula. The animal on the left has this sort of pasty, mustardy color film on its body, whereas the animal on the right doesn't have any of that, but has a few more what look like maybe slightly less healed white scars on them. Well, the animal on the left has what are called diatoms that are adhered to the skin of this animal. And these are little animals that are produced and that grow in the Antarctic feeding season when the sun is out for nearly 24 hours a day. Well, because this water is so cold in the Antarctic, whales, which typically shed their skin pretty regularly, don't do so to save energy and effectively limit the physiological stress of being in such a cold environment. And because of that, things like diatoms are able to grow on their skin. So the animal on the left gives us an indication that this is an animal that's been in the Antarctic for quite some time. On the right, we have a very different case. This is an animal that has no diatom cover on it whatsoever, but it has evidence of being preyed on by what are called cookie cutter sharks. And this is a subtropical or tropical species of shark that live in moderate depth waters and really only occur in very warm areas. So there's good indication that this whale on the right has left the Antarctic recently, gone to tropical waters, and returned to the Antarctic. It likely shed its skin along the way, getting rid of that diatom cover and getting a nice fresh paint job. So images like this and just going out and observing these animals give us an insight as to whether or not all of the animals in this population stay in the Antarctic year-round versus some of the animals that may leave and go into the tropics to give birth. So really interesting things that you can gain just from photographs of these animals. Now, if we were really going to be able to study these animals in what would be the most meaningful way as an animal behaviorist, we want to do something like Jane Goodall did, where you immerse yourself in the environment of these animals and you become part of the environment effectively. And you build these ethograms where you sit there and you watch individuals and you look at how they interact with each other in their environment and how their social systems are created, what they eat, how often they eat, and the different things they do in their daily lives. Obviously, this is very difficult to do with baleen whales and even harder to do with whales that live in the Antarctic, which are quite far away from us. So we need to be able to have tools that take advantage of the time that we do have down there. And we've worked with a company called the Customized Animal Tracking Solutions to develop these non-invasive multi-sensor tags that adhere to whales for 1 or 2 days at a time with silicone suction cups. They measure time, depth, and temperature. And then they also have 3-axis accelerometers, magnetometers, and gyros, which help to create the 3-dimensional movement path of these animals in their environment. These sensors sample at very high rates, so we can be very precise and accurate with our measurements. These tags also record audio, which is something that allows us to understand the sounds that these animals make, as well as the sounds of the environment that these animals may be encountering. Now, one of the other great additions that these tags have is that they have 2K video, and we're building up to 4K, which allows us to see from the animal's perspective what the environment is like where that animal is. That helps us provide context to the behaviors that we measure on the tag as well. And I'll show you some really unique applications of this coming up. The tags also have GPS and a VHF transmitter because when the tag falls off the whale, it floats to the surface. All of the data is archived on that tag, and so we need to recover that tag in order to get the data off. The GPS tells us where the tag is. A VHF transmitter then sends out a small radio signal. We use some radio tracking gear to go locate the tag and literally pick it up out of the water, download the data, recharge the battery, and then send it back out. So in this study, I'm going to talk to you about data we collected a couple of years ago in February and March. We deployed 33 tags, which literally broke the ice for learning about these animals, which before this study had never been tagged. We collected a lot of data. We collected a lot of echo sounder information and thousands of UAS images. But more importantly to me is that the data that we collected are now supporting more than 20 undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral research projects with students at UC Santa Cruz, Stanford, Duke, and a few other universities around the country. Now, this is what the tag looks like on a minke whale up close. They're very small relative to the size of the animal. The animals really don't even respond when we put the tags on and can become curious almost after we tag them. And this is good for us because it indicates to us that the behavior that the animals are showing is not influenced by the tag, and it doesn't appear that way at all. So here's us putting a tag on a minke whale. We work from these small inflatable boats with a bow pulpit. I have a long carbon fiber pole that's very flexible, and the tag sits in a little housing at the end. We try and get close to an animal, and hopefully it surfaces in close enough range that we can reach out and put the tag on its back just like this. You see the animal really doesn't even respond to being tagged. We're in this sea ice environment that we know is where these minke whales live, and they feel very comfortable in here. It takes a lot of expert boat driving to be able to find the animals and then to maneuver in a way that allows us to get close to them. Here's another perspective of putting a tag on. This is from a camera mounted on a helmet of mine. And this animal is literally just bow riding in front of our boat, making it quite easy to tag these animals. Now, of course, I'm only showing you the videos where it all works out, and you're seeing a very small portion of the amount of time that's needed to spend with these animals in order to get close to them and get the tags on and get the data that we require. But the more we work with these animals, the more we're able to understand their behavior and do things that allow us to be more effective and more efficient with getting our tags out. Well, here's what it looks like when we get the data back. The first thing we want to do is just say, where do these animals go and what do they do? So you're looking at here, the dark blue is the water around the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula. The white areas obviously are land. You see the Gerlache Strait on the left and then places like Anvord Bay on the right. The green circles here indicate the places where tags were deployed. And then each tag after that, every dive that the animal does is either labeled as a feeding dive in orange or a traveling or other type of dive in gray. And there's a couple of things that are fairly clear from this. The first is that these animals spend nearly all of their time tucked up deep inside these bays. That makes sense to us because that's where the largest proportion of sea ice is. The areas of open water, like the Gerlache Strait, are areas where minke whales don't tend to go. We think this is largely a result of this being where they are preyed on by killer whales. And you can see when the animals do wander out into open water, they tend to move in a straight line and try and get out of there as quickly as possible. So right away, we get a pretty good indication of where the preferred habitat for these guys is. It's way deep back up into these bays. And the other thing is that these animals are feeding almost all the time, it seems like. There's a ton of feeding way deep into these bays. Well, now we want to look at what the tag data show us from a three-dimensional side. This is what the screen looks like when we get the tag back. You see the video screen in front of you. The orientation of the whale is in the upper left. And then the panel on the bottom here has depth in blue, speed in green, and then what we call the jerk signal in pink. And that jerk signal is an aggregate of the acceleration that's occurring in the animal. So if you are moving very quickly and then you slow down very quickly, in aggregate, that's a large jerk signal. And I'll start to play this and you'll see exactly what happens when you have that large jerk signal. This is a minke whale that's now diving underneath the sea ice. You can see the surface of the water with those little pieces of brash ice and little pieces of bergy bits. This is hot off the presses kind of material. This is stuff that really hasn't been seen before. And what it tells us about is how much time this animal spends under the ice. It finds a little pocket of air, of open water there, dives down below. I'm going to let this play for a minute and you're going to see this animal just kind of cruise down here and then go on a really short dive and you'll see a feeding lunge occur pretty soon. Just feed it up a little bit here. So you're going to see in the upper left, the orientation is going to go down. The animal's going to dive down and then come back up towards the surface and it'll accelerate into a feeding lunge very quickly. Right here, it's coming back to the surface. It opens its mouth, boom, and it just fed and you can see all the krill that are passing by the mouth of that animal. Pretty awesome stuff to be able to see from the animal's perspective when it feeds, what the prey look like, what the ocean conditions and the sea ice habitat are where that animal is. So we use this kind of video to help corroborate when we think we see lunges in the tag data record, so that when we have times when we don't have video associated with it, we have confidence that what we see in the sensors actually indicates foraging. Now, a little bit deeper down, we see some really cool foraging behavior. We're going to look at a bunch of different feeding events from a group of minke whales. There's an animal right there that just opened its mouth. You can see its buccal cavity is distended and full of food. There's another animal right there that just took a bite that's coming up next to it. Another thing that's remarkable to see is how quickly they process that water. Boom, 3 minke whales just lunged right there. You can see how much water gets into their mouth. And look, that animal right there on the right's got another tag on it, which is pretty cool. And look at that animal, that mouth is kind of deflating just like a balloon. And after about 8 or 10 seconds, it's ready to feed again. And that's what allows these animals to have those really fast foraging rates. This would have taken about a minute to do in a blue whale. Now, the other thing that's of note here is that we see 4 or 5 minke whales and sometimes 6 minke whales all feeding at once. This kind of group feeding behavior is something that's never been documented in the species, and it's only because we have these video tags on these animals that we can even see other animals present when this animal is foraging. So some really remarkable dynamic footage of underwater feeding from these guys. And then, of course, the more you look, the more you find some really curious cases. This is a little minke whale who finds a friend in the water column and decides the best thing for it to do is to go investigate. It's a big lion's mane jellyfish, not dissimilar to some of the things we see here in Monterey Bay, but it's pretty funny that this animal finds a jellyfish, decides it wants to kind of muck around with it, sticks it on its nose, and then swims through it and tears it apart. But interactions between minke whales and jellyfish were not something we thought ever would even exist. And only with this kind of data and exploring the world of these animals do we get to find these kinds of really cool incidents. Now, one of the things I mentioned that's really important is sea ice to these animals, and we want to understand how they use this habitat and what exactly they use different types of sea ice for. Well, this is a minke whale that's in nearly 100% sea ice. You can see it's come up to the surface. These pieces of brash ice that are debris from a glacier that's calved are filling the water up, and this minke whale is literally just kind of cruising right up around it, the surface of the water. What's it going to do here? I mean, what would you do in a big pile of ice? Well, if you're worried about being preyed on by a killer whale and you want to hide from them, maybe a good idea is to sort of hunker down in the sea ice and just rest there. That's exactly what this whale does. You see it took a breath right there. We had no idea that minke whales rested in sea ice, but this is pretty darn good evidence that they do that. And this animal did this for a number of minutes at a time, and it just kind of hunkered down here and took a few minutes off to rest and do so in a place where it's unlikely to get preyed on. Now, another thing that we can use these videos for is to quantify the amount of sea ice that these animals encounter and link that to the behavior that we saw on the tags. So in that first video, you saw an animal swimming under sea ice and then feeding. Well, two of the undergraduates in our lab last year wrote this really cool paper where what they did is every time the minke whale came to the surface, they counted up the percentage of sea ice cover that that animal was encountering, either 0%, 20, 40, 60, 80%, whatever it is. They aggregated that over the entire track of that whale. And then on dives where the animal fed, we can then say what amount of sea ice cover was that animal feeding in? Does that differ from when the animal is doing different kinds of events? And it gives us a much more accurate and precise picture of what the minke whales actually use the sea ice for. Are they socializing in it? Are they resting in it? Do they only feed in sea ice? Do they only travel in open water? These kind of clues will tell us about these animals, not only how they exist now, but how they may be impacted by things like climate change as sea ice changes in this region. Now, another way that we look at this data is to put it into three-dimensional space. So those plots that you saw before, even with the video, are kind of two-dimensional, but we take the orientation of the animal, the pitch, the roll, and the heading, and we turn it into this ribbon here. So each of these blue and gray chevrons that you see is 1 second of time of the orientation of the whale. We then animate the track to see how the animal actually uses three-dimensional space. The red and the blue triangles that you see coming out of the track are when the animal is actually accelerating. The yellow spots are where the animal has just rolled onto its side. And so whereas on a dive profile, you might just see the animal being at one depth and not really doing much, when you look in three-dimensional space, you see the animal is actually moving back and forth and going through a prey patch, accelerating quickly, probably opening its mouth, and then turning around and going back through it. And you see that this animal is actually using space in a very different way than you would than you would be able to infer from just 2 dimensions. And then the animal flukes very vigorously to get back up to the surface. So we can use this kind of information just to inform ourselves about what the animals are doing. And then it also provides a pretty fun and interesting and compelling way to let you guys see data and understand how these animals use space. Now, how they use space is really interesting, and we're also quite interested in how this space use relates to where their prey are throughout the day, but also in the water column. And what this here is a heat map showing when and where minke whales feed throughout the day. So at the top of the graph is the surface of the ocean, and then moving down to shallow and deeper water. And then from left to right on the bottom, you have dawn and the daylight hours, and then dusk and then nighttime hours. And the color now indicates the amount of feeding that occurs within that hour of the day in that depth bin. And what we see is a really interesting pattern. We find that during the daylight hours, the only feeding that really occurs is in deep water, and it's pretty moderate, maybe 20 or 30 lunges per hour. You see that changes around dusk, and then at night you have this massive peak of very, very high lunge counts per hour, 80, 90, or 100 lunge counts per hour, but this time in the surface water during the night hours. Well, how does this relate to what the prey are doing is a really interesting question. So here's what we call an echogram. This is from those high frequency echo sounders. The red line that you see is the bottom of the ocean. And what you see here are these kind of clouds of red and green and yellow. Those are individual krill patches. You can see they're pretty big, but they're also pretty deep, and they're not as dense as you might think. Well, when you look at what happens during the daytime, this indicates that there is a lot of food available to these whales, but in order to get to it, they have to dive deep. And because they're diving deep, they may not want to feed as much as at night when that prey changes its behavior dramatically. So now those same prey patches have consolidated. They're very, very dense, and they're very close to the surface. So if you're an animal that either has to dive deep and find a prey patch that's a little more dispersed, or you can wait until that prey comes up closer to the surface where you don't have to look for it very hard, and it happens to be even more dense, that's when you're going to likely increase your foraging rates. And so the changes that we see of these minke whales starting to feed much more frequently at night is because of this change in the prey conditions. So to summarize some of these initial findings, and we're literally doing this stuff all the time and trying to understand these animals better, we found that minke whales have these extraordinary feeding rates. They can lunge up to 25 times in a dive, over 100 times in an hour, and even over 1,000 times in a given day. Their Diel foraging patterns, or their changes from day to night, are consistent with changes in the prey. They follow the prey vertically in the water column and adjust their feeding to be able to take advantage when the prey are the most dense and the closest to the surface. We find that group feeding is common, and we showed you that from the videos. The whales are also remaining largely in these coastal bays and associating with sea ice almost exclusively when it's present. Therefore, there's an increasing potential for competition as conditions change. The sea ice that I mentioned is very dynamic, and when it leaves a lot of open water and it gets packed into one space, that open water is perfect habitat for animals that are not ice dwelling, like humpback whales. In the Antarctic Peninsula right now, humpback whale populations are growing very rapidly because there's a lot of open water. There's also a krill fishery that's taking out quite a bit of krill from this area as well. And one of the things we require is better knowledge of what the needs are for these minke whales, so we can better understand whether or not they have to compete for a limited resource, not only with other whales, but potentially with humans. And as this increase in open water continues to occur, the potential for ship strikes from increased ship use of this critical habitat is likely to occur. Now, I wanted to mention climate change around the Antarctic Peninsula specifically. What this map shows you from a very large scale is sea ice around the Antarctic continent. And all of that purple that you see is sea ice. This is April, and I'm going to go through the months going from fall into the winter in the Antarctic. And you'll see where the sea ice increases from April to May to June and into July and even into August in the very dead of winter. And you can see there's a huge amount of sea ice around the Antarctic continent, except in one place. On the left-hand side there, on the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula, there's nearly no ice. Well, we've also measured that over the last 50 years, the winter air temperatures there have increased by over 8 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius. And instead of having 200 days of ice cover, there's now only 120 days of ice cover. So the conditions in this one part of the world are changing dramatically for animals that are adapted to living in icy environments. You're kind of at a crossroads. Around the rest of the Antarctic, things are pretty stable, but the Antarctic Peninsula is changing very quickly. Now, there are some animals outside of minke whales that are facing the same kind of risks, and this is an Adelie penguin here on the right. And one thing you can do if your habitat changes and you are mobile is you literally can leave that area and go to a place that's better suited for you. That may be what's happening to minke whales. Alternatively, if you don't have the option to go to somewhere else, you don't know where that other place is, or you're tied to some place for some other part of your life history, the only thing you can do is kind of hunker down. It likely means that you're going to have to go farther to find food, that these longer foraging trips are going to mean that you have to spend more energy yourself, which means you're going to have less energy to provision to your offspring. And because of that, your populations are likely to decrease. So neither is a really good scenario for maintaining populations of animals that require sea ice around the Antarctic Peninsula. The other evidence that we have to support things changing in the Antarctic is by UAS imagery. I showed you an image just like this on the earlier of an Antarctic minke whale. Well, 2 days after we photographed this Antarctic minke whale, we photographed this minke whale. Similar species, but a very different animal. This is a dwarf minke whale, a much shorter head, very white pectoral fins. It doesn't have that chevron on the back. And this animal lives in the subtropics and in coral reefs. The fact that they're now making their way down into the Antarctic is a major red flag for us that species that otherwise couldn't survive in very cold conditions are now able to find shelter and potentially make a living in an environment because it's changing so rapidly. Something we really need to keep an eye on. One of the ways that we can try and protect this environment and do our best to try and mitigate these changes to these environment is to develop marine protected areas and sanctuaries, just like the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary that we have here. We're trying to use information that we can collect on the needs and the distribution and the behavior of these whales to find the areas that are the most critical for them and try and cordon those off from things like human activity, like the krill fishery that I mentioned. What we want to do is we want to give these animals the best possible chance for surviving in the face of what we're doing to the planet in very sort of off-putting ways, I should say. So it's up to us to prioritize these kinds of research projects, these kinds of information gathering opportunities, and use that information in a way that allows us to protect the integrity of these animals and the ecosystems that they're a part of. I think there are a couple of ways we can do that outside of science, and I think these include some of the broader impacts that I'm excited about my lab and my collaborators doing. One is to try and share information about these animals with a broad audience. I'm excited to work with folks like Yolandi Harris in the art department here to do installations and express or expose people to the data that we're collecting on these animals in new and very different ways that challenge our intellect and challenge the way we think about how we share information, and also just broaden the type of people that are exposed to the research that we're doing. I'm very excited about this and working with the Institute of Art and Science at UC Santa Cruz as well to develop more content like this to try and promote a better understanding of our oceans and animals through art and visualization. We also try and hit social media and public platforms a lot, working with folks like National Geographic, WWF, and the BBC. We're able to publish a lot of news articles annually on our findings. Last year, we had 70 million people view our content online, and we're writing in the peer review literature as well. So we have traction in our scientific community and also more popularly to try and make what we do and the animals that we study part of our mainstream information content. And I really am hopeful that the kinds of experiences that we have are things that translate and get people excited and motivated and want to conserve and protect not only the animals, but the ecosystems they're part of. And when you have an experience like this with a little curious minke whale that comes up to your zodiac and almost kisses you, it's pretty meaningful. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to study these animals, to work with such great colleagues and students, and to be able to have these kinds of experiences where you really see how curious nature can be, and it really changes you. And I think we're very fortunate to have these opportunities, and to me, it's the best journey in the world. And I'm glad I came along when I did, at a time when I could enjoy going to the Antarctic. I appreciate everything that the university has done for me. If you folks are interested in the work we're doing, I'd encourage you to check out our lab site website, which is listed up here. And if you have the means to and you're interested, you can go to giving@ucsc.edu and write an email and inquire about how to support the research and students in my lab. We're funded exclusively by research grants, and any support that we can get is really helpful to promoting diversity and inclusion in our student body and gaining experience for all types of students. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate it.